Hello and welcome to today's session. We're going to be taking a look at the very first part of Stave 1 of A Christmas Carol, the novella by Charles Dickens. In particular, considering the big question, how is Ebenezer Scrooge introduced to the reader? So Ebenezer Scrooge is the protagonist of the novella. He's the main character and he is a moneylender of sorts. At this time, the regulation of money lending wasn't as it is today, and so wealthy individuals would give out loans or invest in businesses for, in some cases, quite steep returns, and that is what Scrooge does for his income. As we go, we'll be looking at some of the assessment objectives which you need to be able to meet during the exam, so things like reading and understanding the text and being able to respond to it, which is AO1. Analysing the language in more detail, so being able to pick out salient features that are important and ideally use a bit of terminology and talk about the effects, which is AO2. And of course, where possible, bringing in some of that wider knowledge of Victorian times, which is the context of the time which the story was set and written. And that, of course, is AO3. So we're going to have a look, for the most part, focusing on AO2 as we go, but we'll bring in some AO3 as required. But what we will do is we'll kind of read through the story and pause periodically just to discuss some of the kind of key ideas. Marley was dead, to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. So Marley, of course, was Scrooge's former business partner, and we're getting this very emphatic opening telling us that Marley is dead, which is significant because later on, of course, we're going to meet Marley as a ghost, so it's kind of reinforcing that supernatural element. We'll get this nice long list: the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, the chief mourner, just to really emphasise that fact, creates a sort of degree of emphasis. And you might be wondering what this change bit is. Well, it's referring to the exchange where business transactions were done, and so Scrooge is kind of confident in his own name, and he's kind of convinced that Marley is dead, which is why he's surprised when, of course, he begins to think he can see Marley's face in his door knocker. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You'll therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. So what's going on here is a little bit of direct address to the reader. Now, Dickens was a really kind of a big fan of this style of writing. We see it throughout a lot of A Christmas Carol, but also his wider pieces of fiction. So we get this kind of address to the reader. So it kind of creates this kind of conversational tone where we're kind of positioned as a reader as someone listening to a person telling a tale. Now, this feature is called free indirect speech, and what it does is it's a third-person sort of style in principle, but it blends with it some of the kind of the features of first-person narration. So it's in a way the narrator becomes a character talking to the reader and sharing its own thoughts with us. So we have this kind of exclamative mind. I don't know, we need to say I know my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. So he's commenting there on this kind of well-known saying to be dead as a doornail, and kind of actually making a joke of it and commenting on the idea that it may not be the most dead piece of ironmongery in the trade. Ironmongery is just metalwork. So he's kind of pausing a little dramatic aside to kind of comment on the imagery itself. But the whole point of this, aside from a little bit of humour, is to just drive home the idea that Marley is most definitely, unquestionably dead. And the humour is, of course, being used to try and create a very kind of relaxed relationship with the reader, which in part is there to try and make the reader feel at home here, comfortable with the narrator, and eventually, of course, start to adopt the narrator's moral perspective on things. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event. but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral and solemnised it with an undoubted bargain. So what we're being told here is that Marley didn't have many friends. In fact, Scrooge was, as it says here, repeatedly sole executor. So Scrooge was in charge of dealing with the will and making sure it was enacted. He was the one who administered Marley's estate. What that means is he was the one responsible for selling on or dealing with Marley's possessions that remained. And so basically Marley had only really Scrooge as a friend. Now this idea of solitary behaviour or being isolated or alone is a recurring theme in the story, because of course Scrooge is detached from everyone around him, and we're being told that Marley was very similar in that regard. And what the story is trying to do is show us the kind of the steep cost really of being so isolated and detached from society. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Right, quite a dense section here, and you might wonder what's going on. Well, what we have here, again, more use of the indirect free speech. That mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from, so the narrator talking to us is almost like a character. But what's also being used here is an allusion, and that's spelled A-double-L, like this. Hang on a second. An allusion to Hamlet, the play by William Shakespeare. In Hamlet, also basically has a ghost. Hamlet's father, the King of Denmark, has been murdered by Hamlet's uncle, and the ghost of Hamlet's dad comes back to encourage Hamlet to take revenge. So this kind of theme of ghosts and particularly ghosts that come to try and get the protagonist to do something or change in some way. So Hamlet's dad is trying to get Hamlet to take action and take revenge. The ghosts that are going to come in the story to visit Scrooge are here to try and teach him a lesson and get him to change. So this is a kind of a common thread between those two stories. But it's also, again, a little bit of humour, because he's kind of making light of the idea of ghosts visiting the character. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Right, so this is perhaps one of the most important points in Stave 1. It's the introduction of Scrooge himself. So important, in fact, we're going to kind of analyse this and go for it in a lot more detail later on and look at how you might write about this introduction. But just a few key things to kind of comment on to start with. So we get the use of indirect free speech and the commenting on Scrooge's character and the shock that he feels towards Scrooge for his behaviour. So using this exclamative "oh," and also the exclamative here after Scrooge. But what's really particularly interesting is we get this list of very kind of aggressive, uncomfortable, unpleasant verbs: squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. But they're actually being used more like adjectives here to describe his behaviour. But they're all about his kind of tight-fistedness, the way in which he's very miserly and keeps money to himself. A miser is someone who hoards their money. They don't give it away and don't necessarily even spend it, but they make it just to keep it to themselves. And if you covet something, it means you just desire it. All right. So what we're being told here is that Scrooge is very greedy, but he doesn't like to spend his money. And there's even a kind of religious kind of judgment being passed on him here, the idea of sin, because if you are greedy and all you want is money, it kind of goes against morality and kind of the religious values of the time. That's not to say that Dickens was himself particularly religious. He wasn't, as it happens, but he recognises that his readers would have been. So he's kind of playing to those ideas to try and get the readers to pass a judgment on Scrooge, but also by extension a judgment on the rich who hoard their money. We get this nice simile, hard and sharp as flint. Flint is a stone that you use to spark a fire. It's very sharp, almost, and in fact it was used in ancient times as a stone for things like spears and arrowheads because of its sharpness. Solitary as an oyster, another simile. Of course, oysters are a type of seafood, kind of like a clamshell thing, and they tend to be creatures that live on their own. So again, this theme of solitary, isolation, loneliness, all these ideas kind of coming through here. But we also get a semantic field of temperature, the cold, things shriveling, stiffening, and so on. Blue, things to do with temperature. So we get this kind of association with Scrooge with the cold, reflecting, of course, his cold-hearted nature. And we get a little bit of kind of hyperbole and exaggeration, and the frosty rhyme was the idea that frost is actually physically forming on his body because he doesn't like to pay to heat his apartment or his office. He likes to kind of sit in the cold and save his coal, doesn't want to spend money on coal to heat the place. And that, of course, lends nicely to this idea that he's cold-hearted and a bit of a miserable character. You might be wondering what this word dog days means. Well, dog days is an old-fashioned term for a hot day. So basically we're being told that he likes to keep his accommodation and his office cold when it's a hot day, but he also keeps it cold even at Christmas, so in the winter time. So he literally just doesn't like to spend any money on heating. Right, as I say, we're going to come back to this later on, so we'll move on for the time being. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. So again, continuing the semantic field of heat and cold, and the cold being linked to Scrooge as a cold-hearted character, the idea in some ways that he's immune to the warming effects of heat and the sun, and he's also immune to the cold because he's already cold-hearted. Right? He would have been told that no one is as bitter as he. The snow can't even rival him. Right, or the rain. So this kind of miserable weather doesn't kind of compare to him because he's much more miserable than all of the foul weather. What's quite nice here, of course, is the sentence structures. We get the no warmth, no winter, no wind, no falling snow. So aside from being a list, it's a list of negative phrases, and that negativity is quite overpowering and reinforces this kind of negative aspect of Scrooge's character. We're being encouraged here through the sentence structures to see him as a negative, miserable person and start to dislike him to a degree. And then we get this kind of little music humour again, albeit kind of slightly ironic, dark humour. They often came down handsomely and Scrooge never did. So we're talking about the weather here. It's the idea that in Victorian times there was a kind of colloquial phrase or colloquial expression to describe bad weather coming down handsomely, being used ironically, handsome being attractive or pleasant. So people would use that phrase ironically to describe the weather basically coming down miserably. But of course we're being told here that whilst that idiom can be used to describe the weather, it could never be used to describe Scrooge. So the whole idea of this section is to just reinforce the idea of Scrooge's negativity. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Okay, so again, continuing with the negative sentence structures, the no beggars, no children, no man or woman. The idea being, of course, that Scrooge keeps himself separate from all society, and people are a little bit afraid of him. They tend to avoid him, but rather than being, cautioned by that, or made to realise that he's alone and essentially miserable, Scrooge actually quite likes the fact that people keep their distance from him. He's not a sociable character. He consciously chooses to keep himself isolated and alone. All right, it's the very thing he liked. So we're being presented here with a character who is quite aloof from society. So aloof, A-L-O-O-F, is someone who kind of removes themselves and detaches themselves from society and keeps themselves to themselves. And this is an idea that's explored quite extensively in the story because, of course, Dickens was very much of the opinion that the rich were quite aloof and removed from wider society and the problems that society was facing. And so this story is all about how an aloof character like Scrooge is made to realise his social responsibility and his kind of wider role in the society in which he inhabits. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. A counting house is basically just like an office that deals with money, like a kind of a bank of sorts. Anyway, it was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. So, an interesting thing here, we were told now, of course, that it's Christmas Eve. So this is where the story, when the story takes place, and this idea that everyone else is kind of getting ready to celebrate Christmas and, be with their families and their friends at that kind of time of year. And Scrooge, of course, is sat busy alone, counting his money in his counting house. And we get, of course, a continuation of the idea of the cold as a semantic field, cold, bleak, biting. And even the fog kind of joins in with that to an extent. So the idea being that cold and darkness is linked to the idea of ignorance and wrongness, falsity and all that kind of stuff. So this is an important kind of motif during the story, and we see it throughout the novella. Warmth and light is associated with knowledge and truth and purity, and that comes, of course, from a period of time called the Enlightenment. So you may have seen cartoons where a light bulb goes ding above a character's head and it represents they've had an idea. Well, that comes from the Enlightenment idea of light equaling knowledge and truth. And so we might say that someone who knows something is an enlightened person. Well, of course, the opposite is therefore true. Darkness equals ignorance. A lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. So what we see is that the weather is dark because, of course, Scrooge is a character who lives in ignorance of society and his role. So that's kind of continued through the story. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. So the fog here is not what we might think of today. I mean, back in Victorian times, coal was one of the main forms of fuel, and so we had a lot of smog and pollution in the air. Often referred to colloquially in Victorian times as a pea super. So you sometimes wouldn't be able to see much more than a metre or two in front of yourself. Sometimes you would be able to put your hand out in front of you and barely be able to see your hand because of the particulates of carbon hanging in the air caused by all the kind of coal being burnt on such a large scale. But that kind of weather, that kind of atmosphere plays nicely into what Dickens is trying to do here, trying to create this idea of the dinginess, the dark and the gloom where we first meet Scrooge and see him conducting his life, because we need to associate him with this idea of gloomliness, of darkness and ignorance. The fact that everything is obscured kind of plays into that idea that things can't be seen, which is why the houses near him are phantoms. But symbolically, of course, the idea of these houses represents wider society, and the fact that his nearest neighbours can't be seen shows that Scrooge is essentially kind of blind to the society around him, detached from it. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon this clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. So we've now just met the clerk in the office. Now this is Bob Cratchit, the assistant that works for Scrooge, and we're also learning about how stingy and tight-fisted Scrooge is with his money. So Scrooge has a very small fire, so he's quite miserly. He doesn't even indulge in a large fire for himself, but we're getting a little bit of a kind of hyperbole of the fact that the clerk only has a single coal to kind of make a fire, which would be woefully inadequate to make any kind of heat. And we've been told that Scrooge keeps the coal supply in his own room so that people can't just help themselves to make the rooms warmer. So we've been told that he's so tight with his money, so kind of, so much of a hoarder with his own money that he won't even provide, heat for his employees. So what we get is this kind of rather sympathetic image of the clerk trying to kind of warm himself on a candle flame, which of course is never going to be possible. But the idea is we're trying to kind of create some sympathy here for the plight of the clerk and kind of make us feel a little bit cross at Scrooge for not being more generous. Now we get the introduction here of a new character, which is Fred. Now Fred is the nephew of Scrooge. Scrooge had a sister called Fan, and while she died relatively young, she left behind a son, Fred. And Fred is a very generous, very kind character, and constantly trying to encourage his uncle to have a more positive outlook on life. And so he pays Scrooge a visit and tries to get him to essentially join in the Christmas celebrations. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. So, what's interesting here? We get, of course, that legendary catchphrase, "Bah, humbug!" Basically, he's kind of dismissing Christmas, saying rubbish. He doesn't care one bit about it. So reinforcing his kind of negativity. But what's really particularly interesting here is that Fred is associated with light, with heat and glowing. So basically this idea of light equaling knowledge and truth and positivity, well, Fred is connected very much to that. His eyes sparkle. So it's part of that semantic field of light and truth. His face is ruddy, which means it's kind of red, full of energy from his walk, but also that idea of warmth coming through. The fact that his breath smokes. Obviously, when your warm breath hits cold air, you get condensation, but Dickens has chosen to use this word smoked because, of course, it kind of implies heat and fire. So Fred is associated with that kind of positive light imagery as a contrast point to the kind of dark and gloom associated with the ignorant Scrooge. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "humbug." So we get kind of Fred presented here again as a cheerful character, and he's kind of trying to challenge Scrooge out of his miserable outlook on the world and trying to encourage him to be a bit more positive. So he kind of inverts what Scrooge says. So when Scrooge says "you're poor enough," he inverts and says, "well, you're rich enough." So this kind of constant challenge, we get this kind of nice little rhetorical device where he's kind of challenging Scrooge and trying to get him to kind of change his ways. And the whole point of this novella, of course, is that transformation of Scrooge. So although it's really initiated by the appearance of Marley and Marley's ghost, and then obviously the spirits that visit Scrooge over the course of the night, we also see Fred initially trying to encourage his uncle to change. "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer? A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." So, of course, we get the rather kind of savage humour of Scrooge, showing just how much he dislikes Christmas, the idea of boiling people with their Christmas pudding. Basically, Christmas puddings used to be boiled back in this time, so he's kind of suggesting they should basically just be cooked with their Christmas meals, and taking the actual Christmas wreath of holly and using it as a stake through their heart. So obviously this is not literal, it's hyperbolic exaggeration, it's a bit ridiculous, but it just shows us how much Scrooge dislikes the idea of Christmas, because what he wants to do is simply make more money. He wants to be richer every hour, and so Christmas time with people, not working, although they, in Victorian times people did work Christmas Day. Typically Christmas Eve would be time for celebration and merriment, and often nice generous employers might give their employees the day off at Christmas, but it wasn't a common practice. That came much later, was popularised by Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, who kind of brought in a lot of those traditions later on into Victorian English society. But the bottom line is Scrooge simply just wants to make money. He doesn't want to celebrate things. As far as he's concerned, getting to the end of the year, it's all about balancing the accounts. And he's kind of, doesn't like the idea of using that time to reflect on the year and seeing, all of the months on his accounts and looking at it and thinking, well, I haven't made as much money as I wanted. So it's all about money to him, nothing else. "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you, much good it has ever done you." So he's basically trying to dismiss Fred. He doesn't want to join in. And again, we get Fred trying to invert his kind of phrases, trying to kind of challenge his view, but there's no use. At this point, Scrooge seems to be beyond help. "There are many things from which I might have derived good, but which I've not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew, "Christmas among the rest. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as good a time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though there is never but a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." So this is quite important, this section, because Fred is trying to challenge Scrooge's mind, trying to challenge his view of the world, but by extension this is Dickens trying to challenge the view of miserly rich people who lack generosity at Christmas time. Right? Dickens was a very charitable man. He believed very much in the idea that the wealthy had a moral obligation to do more to support the poor. This idea of opening your hearts to the people. We get this nice little description here of fellow passengers to the grave. This is a lovely metaphor, this idea that we tend to use this idea of life as a journey. So we talk about being on a journey from the cradle to the grave. And so this phrase, fellow passengers to the grave, is this idea that we're all travelling together. We're all on the same kind of journey together. And Christmas time is an opportunity to realise that we're all essentially the same. We're all going in the same way at some point. Whereas this is kind of the criticism here that Dickens is imparting, that the rich tend to see themselves as different to the poor. So this is again Dickens trying to bring in the moral criticism here, trying to challenge the view of the rich. And Fred kind of represents these kind of moral values and this kind of positive look, this idea that gold and silver, money essentially, is not as important as that kind of spiritual good, moral good, which Christmas represents. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and I'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." So moved is Bob Cratchit by Fred's speech that he accidentally claps, and then realises, of course, it's not appropriate. Impropriety means inappropriate behaviour, so he kind of worries that he may have upset Scrooge by clapping Fred and what he says. But of course, the clapping, whilst it's very humorous, is there to reinforce the idea that we're meant to support Fred's view of things, not Scrooge's. And then, of course, Scrooge just makes a little bit of a dig at Fred and says, "Why? I wonder you don't go into Parliament." Scrooge is essentially saying that you're a very good public speaker, very good at rhetoric, but essentially he hasn't been moved by what he has to say. So, of course, this kind of brings us on to the reason why Scrooge needs to be visited by the ghosts, because people around him, those who have a stake to him in terms of family and friends, haven't been able to convince Scrooge to change, so he needs some kind of greater intervention provided by the spirits. "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge. "Why? Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than the Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. So Fred is trying to get him to come to dinner. Scrooge kind of goes through the motions of saying that he will, but then he turns it into a joke and saying that he'd rather be dead than go to Christmas dinner. And then he kind of starts getting into an argument about this idea of love being a ridiculous thing. And Fred points out that his uncle wasn't there for the marriage or for the wedding, and now he's saying, well, why using that as an excuse now? You might be wondering what's about this kind of expression, "good afternoon." Normally we use that as a greeting, but in Victorian times it was also used as a way to kind of signal that a conversation was over and done, and that you're ready to part company. Now, it's particularly rude here, of course, because Fred has come into Scrooge's office. So saying "good afternoon" like that is essentially saying "go away." So it's a very rude thing. Normally the "good afternoon" would be used when you meet someone in the street, and so you can continue walking on your way. But here it's a very rude gesture, particularly because, of course, Fred is technically his family, so you'd expect Scrooge to be a bit nicer to him. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I've made the third trial homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. So, of course, we get this nice structural feature here, the repetition of "good afternoon" endlessly, Scrooge not willing to be drawn into conversation, and we get this nice use of kind of Fred's speech to kind of counterpoint that. He begins with the conjunction "and" to kind of emphatically add his greeting on, so we get a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. So he's really kind of labouring the point, trying to get Scrooge to realise just how stubborn and difficult he's being. His nephew left the room without an angry word. Notwithstanding, he stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." So Fred leaves the office, and on the way past he pauses just to say Merry Christmas to Bob Cratchit, and we get this really nice kind of description, cordial, which means friendly. So Bob's perfectly friendly and nice to Fred. We're meant to like Bob. But Scrooge is kind of ungrateful and quite critical. I mean, he's muttering kind of rudely and darkly, being quite critical of his clerk. And then he talks about this idea of retiring to Bedlam. What it basically means, Bedlam is this kind of place of chaos and madness. So he's basically saying he'd rather go mad than, join in with Christmas. This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by a surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for there had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it's more than usual desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." Right, so what we've got here going on is we've been told that when Fred left the building, Bob is also let in 2 other people, and these are charity collectors. They are people going around looking for donations from the wealthy business people in the area to help make additional provision for the poor. Be they've been quite friendly to Scrooge, and they're just assuming that he's going to be liberal, he's going to have that kind of generosity of spirit and be free with his money. But of course we know that Marley and Scrooge were very much alike in their time. They were both miserly, both kind of hoard their money and not be very charitable at all. But we get this kind of important theme of the idea of the poor and destitute. So the poor, those in poverty, were a group of society that Dickens felt great sympathy for. And we'll come on to some of the kind of things that Dickens did in his own way to support them in future sessions. But right now we get this kind of theme of the idea that the rich aren't doing enough to support the poor, right? And there is a moral lesson to be learned here that we are not isolated. We're all part of one society, and we all have a moral duty to do more to help those less fortunate than ourselves, which is what these characters are doing here. They're going around collecting charitable donations to support the poor. "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the pool are in full vigour, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." So you might be wondering what's going on here then. Well, Scrooge is implying that the best place for the poor is to go to prison. This is a reference to something called a Debtors Prison. So in Victorian times, if you were poor and you couldn't pay your debts, you'd be imprisoned for it. And really, really awful kind of environments that they were. And the union workhouses, well, we can take a look at the issue of the workhouse, but essentially this is where the poor people were sent to work. If they couldn't support themselves or pay for themselves, then they were sent to the workhouse, and they were made to kind of stay there to the end of their days, working long hours with very few breaks, living off poor food, and very, very unpleasant environment to be kind of stuck or trapped in. And in fact, in some respects, the union workhouses were much more like prisons than places where the poor could go for help. So Scrooge's view is that basically people can either go to prison or go to the workhouse if they're poor. He doesn't want to help whatsoever. We'll take a look at the poor law in a bit more detail in a moment, so we'll come back to that shortly. "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," so Scrooge replied. So it's important we notice that want and abundance have been capitalised here, because these are key ideas. They are abstract nouns. Want meaning the need or desire for something that will support you and keep you alive, and abundance in this case meaning that there's plenty of things to support you, lots of food, lots of drink. Abundance is this idea of life and vitality and everything being there to support you. So their view, of course, is that Christmas time is an abundant time of year when people can afford to be more generous and more kind to those who are in need of things, who feel the want. And of course, we're also going to meet want as a character later in Stave 3. The character want and ignorance are important. So it's worth kind of pointing out that the first time we are not introduced to want as a character, but the first time want is introduced as an idea is back here in Stave 1. So we saw this reference earlier to the poor law and the union workhouses. So let's have a kind of pause there for a moment. Just have a think about what these are in more detail. So what became of the poor in Victorian society? We've got to keep in mind that unlike today, where we have a social welfare system that was introduced following World War II to try and help repair Britain after the war, and it's kind of endured up to this moment today, where we basically provide benefits and various allowances or tax credits to support people on lower incomes. Back in Victorian times, there was no welfare system at all. Basically, you were very much on your own. And in the situation at that time, it was the job of local councils, whether the council of a town or a parish council, to look after the poor in their particular area. And it was paid for predominantly by taxes on the middle and upper class citizens. They were the ones who paid for the provision. But what happened as time went on, there were more and more complaints from the wealthy people, because they were under the impression that the poor were basically lazy, avoiding work and basically just doing everything they could to get money for nothing. Now, of course, that idea is nonsense, but that was a viewpoint that they held. And they felt that their taxes were too high and they were losing too much money to support the poor. So what happened eventually is Parliament passed something called the Poor Law in 1834. And the idea was to reduce the cost of looking after the poor in each of these parts of the country, but also to standardise the care that was given to the poor. Because up to that point, you could have different councils doing different things. And so the idea was to have one cost-effective, simple solution that would be the same everywhere in the country. So what happened was that the various councils and parishes were grouped together into these things called unions, and each union had the responsibility to build a workhouse. And this would be a great big building, almost like a warehouse, or almost like a warehouse crossed with a dormitory school, where the poor would be sent to live and work. But it came with the condition that they could only get help if they agreed to leave their homes and go into the workhouse. And the conditions in them were awful. They were very harsh. The clothing that they would be given would be a uniform, and it would be very kind of unpleasant materials. They'd be split, of course, from friends and family. So if you were a family that went to the poorhouse, men and women would be separated. So your families would be split up. And in fact, if you were a family going into the poorhouse, you'd only see your family members for half an hour each week, because the rest of the time you were kept split according to gender and made to work long grueling hours, doing sometimes quite unpleasant and difficult work. In some cases, quite dangerous work. It wasn't unheard of for young boys in the workhouse to be sent away to do jobs in factories or mines or even as chimney sweeps. And of course, there were lots of physical risks associated with such work. So here we have a picture of a Victorian workhouse in operation. We can see all of the people sat having a meal in this case, sat in rows in rather unpleasantly cramped circumstances. All of the kind of people segregated according to gender. So here we have the men. Here's a picture of the women in a workhouse. This isn't the same workhouse. These are different places, but it gives you an idea of what the environment would have been like. So you'd have had these kind of supervising matrons and wardens looking after the essentially the inmates, keeping them in check. So yeah, like I say, less like a kind of an accommodation for the poor, and much more like being sent to a prison where you're meant to do long hours of labour. And this is what Scrooge thinks is a suitable environment for the poor, right? And it's well known that Dickens absolutely loathed the idea of the workhouses. He felt that they were inhumane and cruel places, and he wanted something more to be done to prevent people from ending up in them. So the charity collectors are under the assumption that Scrooge is going to make a donation. Scrooge says he's not going to give them anything. Scrooge says, how much do you want to be put down for? And he says nothing. And so what they think is he means that he doesn't want his name to be put against the donation. He wants to be anonymous. But he doesn't mean that at all. He simply means he wants to give them nothing. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, says Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I've mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. So, he's talking about the idea that he pays his taxes to support the workhouses, and as far as he's concerned, that's all he's prepared to do. That's his obligation, right? And he doesn't like this idea that the poor being helped, because as far as he's concerned, he thinks the poor are idle. This idea of them being lazy. So Scrooge epitomises that Victorian wealthy idea that the poor were poor because they were lazy individuals refusing to do work. Of course, the reality is far from that. The truth is that in many situations, the wealthy business owners deliberately kept the poor by paying them very low wages, controlling their income so that they could just about manage to get by, but would never be in a position to rise out of their social position, and there'll be no social mobility. The idea, of course, with Scrooge being a moneylender is that he benefits from people being poor, because then they have to borrow money. All right, it's like almost like a payday lender in some respects. So he exploits the poor. So he has a vested interest in not helping them. And so what's going on here is that Dickens is criticising the rich and their behaviour, criticising their attitude to the poor, but also criticising the rather distant and sometimes cruel role that they play in society in perpetuating the situation, making it much, much worse. Now, something else going on here with this idea of surplus population. So we have some more contextual stuff. So we talked about AO3 being context and needing to know it earlier. Well, this idea of the poor dying and reducing the surplus population is an idea that comes from a man called Thomas Malthus. So Malthus was a clergyman and a scholar. He wrote books and things as well as being a religious man, and he lived between 1766 and 1834. And he was, for the most part, wrote books about economics, and he was interested in the relationship between natural resources and goods and the growth of populations. And he says in an essay on the principle of population this idea that the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. So subsistence is kind of support, life-giving things, so resources that will help mankind survive. But what he's saying is that population growth is much stronger, that it runs away with itself. So the population continues to grow and grow and grow to the point where it actually outgrows the ability of the land to support the population. So what we're really talking about is this idea that as populations grow, there's a greater pressure on natural resources, and eventually things will simply run out. So he was thinking about, well, what can help this? What can kind of stop that being a problem? So in Malthus, his ideas, he talked about the idea of there being positive checks on population, things that will actually kill people off by increasing the death rate. And he gives examples of hunger, disease and war being chief among those. Now, of course, poverty creates both hunger and disease. So in Malthus's ideas, the death of the poor was perhaps in some ways a positive check against uncontrolled population growth. And this was an idea that kind of found favour with the wealthy, but it was an idea that Dickens absolutely loathed. He hated Malthus's ideas because he found it very insensitive and in some regards quite immoral. And then, of course, there are other kind of checks in Malthus's idea, that things like birth control, not getting married and having babies, not having sex and having babies, those can also be used to control population growth. But as far as Malthus was concerned, hunger, disease and war, these positive checks that increase the death rate, were far more effective than these preventative checks. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the kind of morality around Malthus. I think he's in some respects been misunderstood, and particularly in his time he was kind of loathed by a lot of the kind of more socialist leaning writers. But Malthus himself wasn't making a moral judgment as such. He was simply describing, from a very abstract economic kind of point of view, the idea that resources will eventually run out if the population gets too big. But Dickens didn't like him, didn't like the idea. To put it another way, in some respects, the moral backlash against Malthus reminds us of this chap, Thanos from the Avengers. So for those of you who know the story or the comic books or the movies, Thanos is trying to kill half the universe because he's worried that there aren't enough resources in the universe to support all life. So his plan is to basically use the Infinity Gauntlet to snap his fingers and kill off half of the universe's population so that the other half can live more comfortably. Now, in a way, what he's representing there is the same ideas as Malthus, this idea that there needs to be checks and balances against population growth to preserve the resources for the others. But the problem with Malthus's views, of course, is that it doesn't take account for the fact that there are some people who take more than their fair share of those natural resources, particularly the rich. And this is what Dickens' objection was largely based around, that the rich take more than their fair share, and actually with more consideration there should be enough to support everybody. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge returned his labours with an improved opinion of himself and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. So you get in the same thing of saying good afternoon as a dismissal, so again more rude behaviour. But we also seeing him very much as a man who's occupied only with himself. He's very selfish. Another way of saying that is he's what we call an individualist. So an individual, obviously a person on their own. So an individualist believes very much in the idea that they are solely responsible for themselves. Whether they're rich or poor, it's down to the individual. If you're rich, it's because you worked hard, you made your money. And if you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard enough on your own. So individualists believe in the principle of individualism. And Scrooge is very much part of that kind of political view. But of course, that is not how Dickens sees things. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. So interestingly, just after he's dismissed the charity collectors, we get the return of the fog and the darkness. So symbolically, it's the idea of ignorance and, falsehood and all the kind of the negative aspects of humankind being represented here by the darkness. And Scrooge is very much part of that. His ignorance, and he's ignorant because, of course, he won't, give money to the poor. He won't treat people who are worse off than him with more kindness and consideration. So the darkness symbolically represents that. The cold became intense. In the main street at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled at the lamp heap of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. So we get the idea of the cold again, Scrooge being connected to the cold because he's unpleasant, but what we're also doing is we're moving outside now to see the kind of the beginnings of the hustle and bustle of people getting ready for Christmas. So we see people gathered together. We've got the kind of labourers gathered around a fire. So there's a barrel with a fire in it, and these ragged men and boys have been working and gathered around together in companionship. And so because they are together, we see them, linked to warmth Winking, of course, the idea of bright eyes, the blaze again, heat and light. So because they are all together, they link to ideas of light and kind of the positive ideas. Whereas things that are cold and alone, like Scrooge and like the water, are linked to cold and nice. Now, this is an important word, misanthropic. So a misanthrope is someone who detaches themselves from society because they hate the company of their fellow human beings. So misanthropic is the adjective for misanthrope. Let me just put misanthrope on here. Misanthrope. So a misanthrope is a noun, misanthropic is the adjective. So Scrooge, very much like the ice, is a misanthropic character. He hates wider society and keeps himself detached from it. But everywhere else we're seeing kind of the idea of life and vibrant kind of things happening. We're seeing the poultry as basically a shop that sells birds like turkeys and chickens and what have you. The greengrocer selling vegetables. They are creating this glorious pageant. What it means is like a glorious parade. So they're kind of decorating their shops. They're putting out lots of food and things to celebrate Christmas. So we get this contrast between the dark and gloomy Scrooge and the kind of the light and energy that's growing as Christmas time draws near. The Lord Mayor in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the babies sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. So we're being told the mayor is having his great big party, putting on a big show, and even people who've got very little money. So we have the tailor who got drunk and had a fight in the streets, who's been fined quite a substantial sum of money. Even he's still going to the trouble of putting on a big Christmas meal, to contrast with Scrooge. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones as gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "Oh, bless you, merry gentlemen," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog in even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expecting clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. So we get this poor child that comes along, and he's not begging as such. He's basically singing a Christmas carol to Scrooge and hoping, getting some money, which he can then use to buy some food. But rather than take pity on this young innocent child who's basically gnawed by the cold and hunger, this really, really kind of destitute boy, he's rude to him and basically threatens to hit him and drives him away in terror. And then Scrooge, of course, returns back to the congenial frost. So congenial means friendly. So the fact that Scrooge sees the cold and the frost as a friendly, kind of comforting thing shows us just how kind of warped and corrupted his view of the world has become. He's linked very much to the cold. Anyway, so Bob Cratchit is about to head off home. That concludes things for this session. I hope you found it useful, but otherwise take care and bye for now.